So A Color for Life, Elizabeth Simcoe's Niagara Experiences, is some research that I started looking into what Elizabeth Simcoe's life was like while she was here in North America for 5 years. And one of the primary resources that I read through while I was doing this research was Elizabeth's diary. And while I was reading through her diary, which included a few letters that she wrote, I noticed two rather remarkable things about her. The first is that she saw the world as a work of art waiting to be put to paper. And the second is that she was willing to put up with just about anything in order to achieve that pursuit. And so as we're going through this, we're going to be looking at Elizabeth's travels and experiences through this extraordinary mindset that she had and through this extraordinary ability that she had to kind of set everything else aside in order to have her art. And I'd like for you to keep these desires and her view of the world in the back of your mind as we go along. And all of the following images, unless I kind of note otherwise, are pieces of art that she did throughout her lifetime, including these two. These are some really beautiful watercolors of caterpillars and butterflies. One of the things that we know Elizabeth took particular care to do throughout her travels was to look at plants and animals that were native to the areas that she was in. We'll start at the beginning of Elizabeth's story. Elizabeth Posthuma Gwilym was born in Whitchurch, Herefordshire in 1766. Her father was Colonel Thomas Gwilym, and he died 7 months before her birth. And her mother, Elizabeth Spinks Gwilym, died in childbirth. And because she was orphaned pretty much immediately, she earned the middle name Posthuma. She was sent to live with her mother's sister and husband, Admiral Samuel Graves, and his wife, Mrs. Margaret Graves. Her parents left an enormous fortune upon their death that she inherited and kind of lived the rest of her life on. Elizabeth was very well educated, and she cared quite a lot about her own education, in particular art education. And this is a portrait of her that was done in 1790 by a friend of hers, Marianne Bergs. John Graves Simcoe was the son of Captain and Mrs. John and Catherine Simcoe. He was born on February 25th, 1752. He served in the 35th Regiment of Foot during the American Revolution and was made captain of the Queen's Rangers in 1777. After he achieved the rank of lieutenant colonel, he returned to England in 1782 and paid a visit to his godfather, who gave him the middle name that he's got, Admiral Samuel Graves, who you might remember was Elizabeth's guardian. And while he was visiting the Graves home, he fell madly in love with Elizabeth, and the two of them were married 6 months later. Elizabeth was 16 when they were married, and John was 30. This is a portrait of John that Elizabeth drew herself. I really love it, mostly because John has signed the bottom of it, and it says there, "Your most obedient and most faithful servant, J.G. Simcoe." After the Simcoes were married, they purchased and moved to Wolford Estate, which is pictured here as it was when the Simcoes bought it. This drawing is not done by Elizabeth, but it was done by another contemporary. But you can see how large of a house it is. Not only did they purchase the house, they also purchased about 5,000 acres of land surrounding the house. And all of that space came in handy for them because by 1791, the couple had 5 daughters, Eliza, Charlotte, Henrietta, Caroline, and Sophia, and 1 son named Francis. While they were living at Wolford, they kept a very large staff to upkeep the house. So servants, maids, nurses, gardeners, cooks, etc. They were very happy in their domestic life. They really enjoyed being at home together, being at home with their children, but they were also very pleased when John was elected to Parliament in 1790, and shortly thereafter he was appointed Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, which meant that he was going to have to go to North America for a while. The Simcoes did not want to interrupt their children's education, and so they decided to leave most of the children at Wolford Hall in the care of a woman named Mrs. Hunt, who was a family friend. And Elizabeth decided to bring only 2-year-old Sophia and 3-month-old Frances with herself and John as they departed for Canada. Oh, and my computer has frozen. Hang on just a second. Oops. All right, so this is a timeline of the Simcoes' time in Canada. So in the fall of 1791, they crossed the Atlantic from England. Before they took that Atlantic journey, they actually had dinner with King George III and Queen Charlotte twice before leaving. So that gives you kind of an idea of how important John Simcoe is considered to be within the British government. After they arrive, they spend that first winter until June in Quebec. Then they travel from Quebec to Niagara, and then they spend the next several years bouncing around between Niagara and Toronto, kind of back and forth, totaling 5 years in Canada because they returned to England in the fall of 1796. And this painting that is behind the timeline here is a painting that Elizabeth did while they were crossing the Atlantic Ocean. One of the things that she did to help herself from being seasick all the time was she would go up onto the deck and paint the islands that they would pass on their journey. So that's something that's kind of interesting to think about as a method to cure seasickness. And she really enjoyed that Atlantic crossing. She loved being on the boat and seeing new things. One thing that is, I think, especially important to note is that Elizabeth Simcoe is a woman who is used to having everything at her disposal and having really everything that she wants. If we're thinking back to how big Wolford Hall was, she is exceptionally wealthy, and it seems kind of amazing that someone like her would choose to give up that lifestyle in favor of coming to Canada, where she would have to pretty much rough it for the next 5 years. And you'll see how rocky things kind of get for the Simcoes. But she really, again, sees the world as a painting and as a piece of art that she can take down and remember. And I think what really encapsulates this is this lovely description of Quebec that she gives on April 8th of 1792. She describes it as, she says, the shipping and lower town are immediately below, and towards the height of Abram, the blue distant hills of Vermont are seen, and the spray from the fall of the river about 8 miles off. The rocks and brushwood that adorn the precipitous side of the hills form a fine background to this grand scene with which we were so delighted that we came to view it again in the evening and did not return home till it was dark, or rather starlit. And this is the view that she's kind of talking about. This is the lower and upper towns. And, you know, maybe to us, especially from this sketch, it doesn't look like a lot, but her description of it is really, really beautiful. And that's something that's kind of a special outlook. While the Simcoes were in Quebec, Elizabeth was regularly invited over to look at art and maps in other people's houses. Many of those pieces she copied later on for her own self. On March 22nd of 1792, she wrote that a Captain Fisher, quote, lent me his portfolio, in which was some beautiful views taken in the island of St. Domingo. I almost regretted having not been in the West Indies. This is from a woman who would later complain in her diary every time the temperature got above 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's a great example of Elizabeth's willingness to put up with things that she doesn't like hot weather, in order to see beautiful things. She spent a ton of time in nature throughout her time in Canada and would go out in carrioles, which are pictured here. They're like sleds, essentially, for winter excursions, and would regularly walk for miles to get to particularly pretty scenery if the carrioles couldn't go to wherever she wanted to go. She was definitely not afraid to be adventurous when she was out wandering. On January 18th of 1792, she wrote that she walked across the frozen river, which might not seem remarkably brave to any of us who live in cold climates where water freezes over entirely. But 2 days before this entry, she wrote that she and John had attempted to cross the same river, and John fell in and almost got sucked under the ice, which he surely would have drowned if that happened. So that is kind of a brave and maybe not the smartest idea on her part to try to walk across this area where her husband had nearly fallen in the day before, but that's how she liked to do things. She was not afraid to give it a go. While in her pursuit to drink in as much of the world as she could, Elizabeth was very fearless, where many people in her station would have been pretty apprehensive or even terrified to do the same things that she was doing, particularly, roaming around in Canada. If we're thinking back to that timeline that I showed you at the beginning, of what the Simcoes are doing in Canada, you probably noticed that she and John are bouncing around quite a lot in that 5 years. There's not a lot of stationary life. And for someone who was very wealthy in the 18th century, that might have been very daunting. But Elizabeth recognized this kind of fearlessness in herself, and she wrote on February 15th of 1792, "I quite enjoy the thoughts of the long journey we have before us and the perpetual change of scene it will afford. But the people here think it as arduous and adventurous an undertaking as it was looked upon to be by my friends in England." And here she is talking about the trip from Quebec to the Niagara region. And this is a painting that she did while on her way to the Niagara region. It's a bend in the St. Lawrence River. And it's a really beautiful scene and really does capture some of the beauty of North American waterways. But I love this picture, and I love this idea of her, everyone telling her, you're crazy to think that you can do this. You're crazy to think that this is a good idea. And she embraces it wholeheartedly and is excited to go to new places and see new things. She really loved traveling by bateau, which are small vessels, and canoe, and would frequently take day trips in canoes in the spring and summer throughout her time in Canada, where she would go out in waterways and paint scenes like this beautiful one. When the Simcoes first arrived at Niagara on July 26th of 1792, they were given lodging in Naval Hall, which was a building just across the river from Fort Niagara. Unfortunately, when they arrived, Elizabeth wrote that it was, quote, "undergoing a thorough repair for our occupation, and was still so unfinished that the governor ordered 3 marquees to be pitched for us on the hill above the house." So again, this is a woman who is used to living in mansions with tons of money. She arrives at her new home and is told, "Your house is so broken, you have to live in tents." However, in her usual adventurous and easygoing ways, Elizabeth follows up the disappointment of having to live in the tents with this quote, "Our marquees command a beautiful view of the river and the garrison on the opposite side, which being from its situated on the point, has a fine effect, and the poorness of the building is not remarked at this distance, from whence a fine picture might be made." This is not the view that she was specifically talking about where their marquees were, but this is a really beautiful view of where the Simcoes are living. And she's even taken care to label this portrait here, painting here. So if we look all the way on the far left of this painting, you'll see a capital letter D and a little bit of a smudge next to it. That is the Toronto shoreline. Underneath it, you'll see a little building with a letter A on the roof. That is Naval Hall. So that's the house that the Simcoes were living in. And across the river, you'll see a big pitched roof with a small letter B next to it. That is Fort Niagara, and that pitched roof is of the French castle, as we like to call it today, and it is still standing here. But this is a view of what the Niagara River and Lake Ontario, which is the water and kind of the forefront there, looked like for the Simcoes in the 1790s. Like most of us, Elizabeth Simcoe was absolutely astounded by Niagara Falls the first time that she saw them, and she fell absolutely in love. Her first visit, which was on the same day as their arrival, July 26th of 1792, brought us this description. The fall itself is the grandest sight imaginable, from the immense width of the waters and the circular form of the Grand Fall. I descended an exceedingly steep hill to get to the Table Rock, from whence the view of the falls is tremendously fine. For those of you who are familiar with Niagara Falls or have been, kind of in modern times, what we see today, the water that goes over the falls in modern times is only a fraction of the total volume of water. We have the Niagara Power Authority set up both in New York and also in Canada on either side of the Niagara River, and those divert a fair amount of water away from the falls in order to generate power. So the falls that Elizabeth Simcoe was seeing and the rocks that she was climbing on next to these falls was much more powerful than even what you see today. And that's an amazing thing to think about, I think. Throughout her time at Niagara, Elizabeth regularly rode her horse to the falls to sketch and paint and journal. And she was not afraid to climb around on the rocks above and below to get good angles. At one point in a spring, she sits so close to the bottom of the falls that her attempted painting was actually ruined because of all the water that was splashing onto the paper. So again, she is not scared to sit next to this powerful waterfall in order to get the picture that she wants to put onto paper. Another favorite haunt of Mrs. Simcoe's was the Niagara Whirlpool, which is a little bit downriver from the falls and the rapids that are near it. On April 23rd of 1793, she paints this beautiful picture with words, and that perfectly describes the sketch that we see here. I rode to the whirlpool. Vast rocks surround this bend of the river, and they are covered with pine and hemlock and spruce. Some cascades among the rocks add to the wild appearance. These scenes have afforded me so much delight that I class this day with those in which I remember to have felt the greatest pleasure from fine objects, whether of art or of nature. Most of her time at Niagara was spent living at Naval Hall, but Elizabeth did enjoy going to stay for a couple days, sometimes even a couple weeks, at other officers' houses in the area, several of whom became close friends and lived in and around Queenston, Ontario. One of her more remarkable visits was at Major and Mrs. Smith's home, where she got to interact with their two tame pet raccoons, which she really, really enjoyed. And the first winter that Elizabeth and John were at Niagara, Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter who she and John named Catherine. Elizabeth also really loved being on top of the escarpment, which is essentially a large cliff that surrounds the Niagara region. And she went up to the top as frequently as she could. In the summer of 1793, she actually spends several weeks with the Queen's Rangers camped on top of the escarpment, for which she enjoyed really beautiful views, like the one that we see here, and the cool breezes that came up through there she especially enjoyed. She did not like heat. She was essentially glamping while she was up top on the escarpment because she had, 3 tents to herself. Someone was bringing her dinner every day and her servants were with her. But she really enjoyed the feeling of being a little bit self-sufficient and kind of, the feeling of having run away from home, as it were. One particularly charming anecdote that she gives is on July 21st of 1793. She says, "By some mistake, my dinner did not arrive from Naval Hall one day last week, but I had some of the excellent New York biscuits which I ate and said nothing about my dinner, feeling a pleasure in being able to be independent." Again, this is a woman who's never had to miss a meal before, and she doesn't see it as a terrible event. She sees it as part of this grand adventure of camping on top of the escarpment. And what a unique mindset for someone like Elizabeth to have. The Simcoe family moved to Toronto for the first time in the summer of 1793, as Governor Simcoe was very intimately involved in the planning and construction of that city. Elizabeth spent a great deal of time down by the lakeshore, riding her horse and fishing in the warmer months, and then walking out onto the ice in the winter. Being located along a trade route and being the wife of a governor meant that she also came into regular contact with and befriended many Indigenous peoples, both local and from far away. One man from the Ojibwa tribe, who was called the Great Sail, became great friends of the Simcoes and brought his family for a visit and a lengthy stay with the family in their home in January of 1794. Unfortunately, in March of 1794, baby Catherine caught a fever and passed away. Elizabeth was very heartbroken for her baby, and Catherine was buried somewhere near Toronto. And understandably, there are not very many diary entries for a few weeks after Catherine passes away. While in Toronto, John and Elizabeth purchased 200 acres of land for Francis to inherit when he reached adulthood. And upon it, they began the construction of a log house based on classical Greek temples, which they jokingly christened Castle Frank, and that's what is depicted here. The original Castle Frank, as shown in this portrait, was burned down in 1829, but it lives on in modern Toronto as Castle Frank Road, which runs near where Castle Frank originally was, and Castle Frank train station. Most of the drawings and paintings Elizabeth did were of pretty landscapes, of plants or animals that she or others had seen, but she also had quite a knack for map drawing, and she created several maps depicting journeys that she or John went on in North America, as well as charting her own surroundings. Her talents were such that she actually created maps specifically for John's use in an official capacity. This map is a route that Elizabeth took at least once, but I believe she took it a couple of times from what is in modern day East Montreal to Three Rivers. And you can see from the way that she draws it that it looks like a pretty accurate kind of line drawing map. You can notice also that the points that she labels along the route have numbers next to them. That is her charting how many miles between each point there are. And it looks pretty good. And when you lay it on top of a modern map, you can see that it's actually pretty darn accurate for someone who is not having access to satellite imagery like this is. This is a pretty good rendering of that route. And then again, I think this map is even more remarkable. This is a map charting the route from Niagara to Detroit. And what makes this map even more remarkable is that Elizabeth did not go on this trip. John had to go to Detroit at one point, and this is a map that she drew based on a line drawing that someone else on his crew had done, as well as John's recollections of where they stopped. And so you can see in the upper left corner, she's done a bunch of math to determine how far apart everything is by miles. And then the other kind of neat thing that she's done here on this map If you look closely, you'll notice that some of the places have dates next to them. So for example, all the way over on the far right is the date March 10th. And that is Elizabeth noting when the trip, when the party had reached those spots along the way, which is pretty remarkable. And again, she didn't go on this trip. And if we look at this map on top of a modern map, again, you can see this is actually a pretty good rendering of how the group traveled along the route from Niagara to Detroit. So this is it's a really neat thing to think about as someone who not only is a very talented sketch artist and watercolorist, that she can do these really amazing line drawing maps of routes that she has been on and also routes that she hasn't been on, and what a useful skill that would be for the governor of Upper Canada to have. While Canada was generally an enjoyable experience for Elizabeth, she did feel the intense tensions that existed between the United States and England in the 1790s, and she frequently had nightmares about being ambushed or taken prisoner of war by American forces. In classic Elizabeth fashion, though, she had a positive outlook even on these very real fears, writing on May 15th of 1794, "The apprehension of war with the United States engages my attention very disagreeably. At the same time, I reflect that I should not have less anxiety in any other part of the world. Had we remained in England, probably the governor would now be going on the European continent, where campaign follows campaign without a prospect of peace. And here, if a war takes place, the result may be speedily decisive." 4 months after she has this very wise observation, Elizabeth, Sophia, and Frances were sent to Quebec in September of 1794 as tensions mounted between the Americans and the British. There was fear that there might be war outbreaking here in the Niagara region, and so she and the children were sent to Quebec. John had to stay, however, in the Niagara region in order to assist and direct the military forces that were here. And Elizabeth painted this image as the ship that she and the children are on is sailing away from Niagara towards Quebec. And if you look on the left side of the painting, there's a cliff and there's a line drawing all the way up to the sky, and you can see it says N and it's a little bit scratched out. That's Fort Niagara on top of that cliff. And then if you look across, you can see Naval Hall is marked with a line. And so this is her on a ship in Lake Ontario as they're sailing away towards Quebec. And what an interesting painting, and what an interesting thing to think about, and a memory to put to paper of having to leave with your children for fear of war and leave your husband behind potentially in the line of danger. I think that this is a really emotional painting for Elizabeth, even though it might seem like just a landscape. Luckily for the Simcoes, war did not end up breaking out, and Elizabeth and the children returned to the Niagara region just a few short months later. They left Niagara in September of 1794. They start their journey back to Niagara in February of 1795. So luckily, the separation is short, and they can return back to this area that they so loved very soon afterwards. The Simcoe family returned to England in the fall of 1796. Elizabeth wrote that she cried nearly the entire day when they left Niagara. Back at Wolford, the couple had 4 more children. They had John, who died very young, Henry, another baby whom they named Catherine, and Anne. In 1806, John fell ill while traveling to Portugal on a military mission. He was quickly returned home, but he passed away shortly thereafter at the age of 54. And he was buried at Wolford Chapel, which was on the estate property and is pictured in the painting here. Elizabeth lived another 44 years. She passed away in 1850 at the age of 84 and is also buried at Wolford Chapel. I decided to end this presentation with a drawing of the French castle, which you might remember I pointed out in the big picture that Elizabeth first painted when they first came to Niagara. This is the oldest building at Fort Niagara. It's still standing today, and it was drawn by Elizabeth Simcoe in the 1830s. She based it off of a drawing that was sent to her by a friend, but it goes to show that even when she was settled back into her exceptionally comfortable life in England, she was still thinking of Niagara and those 5 years of adventure that she had in Canada, where she took down the vast beauties of the world that she got to see in paintings and sketches, remained very close to her heart for the rest of her life. Here are the image credits for all of the images that I used here. I would like to give a huge thank you to Library and Archives Canada and the Archives of Ontario, who graciously allowed me to use images that they had digitized in their collection. I would also like to give a very big thank you to Lee Gugino, who did the map overlays and that graphic design work for me. Here are some recommended resources if you're interested in learning a bit more about Elizabeth or John Simcoe. The first two are different editions of her diary, and they are very interesting to read through and see what each of the different editors finds interesting about Elizabeth's life, as well as which sketches and paintings they decide should go into the work. The third one down is actually a book that John himself wrote. It is a book about his operations in the Queen's Rangers, from when he gets promoted to captain of the Queen's Rangers to the end of the American Revolution. And then the final resource there is an online exhibit from the Archives of Ontario called The Travels with Elizabeth Simcoe, a visual journey through Upper and Lower Canada. And they've got some of the paintings that I've featured here in my presentation, as well as many, many others, and some other very interesting information. So I do highly recommend that you check those out. But for now, I think we are going to open things up to some questions and answers. So I'll hand that over to Erica.
You guys are welcome to chat your questions if you'd like, or you can use the raise hand icon if you'd like. Do you have a favorite fun fact about Elizabeth Simcoe?
One very interesting thing about her that I learned while I was doing this research is that she had an intense interest in rattlesnakes, of all things. So that quote that I read to you about her first visit to the falls, where she talks about climbing down onto the Table Rock, the end of that quote, which I cut off, is her describing how most women won't go onto that Table Rock because there's usually rattlesnakes there, and her kind of disappointment that there wasn't a rattlesnake. Anytime someone she knows sees a rattlesnake, it's written in the diary. Anytime someone tells her like a new antidote for a rattlesnake bite, it's put into the diary. There's even a point when the construction of Toronto is being built, and the men who are out there building it are telling her, we kill about 60 rattlesnakes a day. And she is so fascinated by this that Captain Smith, who's heading up one of the construction crews, catches 2 live rattlesnakes and puts them in a barrel so that she can come and poke at them with a stick. So it was a very interesting thing to kind of pop out of this very wealthy woman who wants to get her hands on a rattlesnake so bad. Kind of a funny thing to think about.
Do you have any insight on Elizabeth's thoughts about the beginning of the end of slavery in Upper Canada?
Unfortunately, no. So for those of you who are not aware of this, John Simcoe in 1793 helps to pass some legislation and advocates for some legislation that makes it illegal for for slaves to be brought from the United States into Canada. And it basically says any slaves who are still living, they are enslaved until their death, but really people can't buy more slaves after 1793 in Canada. We know that this is happening, you know, as modern day viewers looking back, this was a significant political event. Unfortunately, Elizabeth doesn't write really anything about it in her diary at all. So unclear what she may or may not have felt. Her husband was very much an abolitionist, but she doesn't really say what she feels on the matter.
Did she do a lot of painting when she went back to England?
Yes, she was an avid painter throughout her lifetime. She did watercolors primarily and sketches. She drew as well. She didn't always paint, but yeah, she painted her whole life long.
Was the name Posthuma considered mean-spirited?
Considered what? Sorry?
Mean-spirited.
I don't think so. I think it was more to honor her parents and to kind of maybe draw attention to the fact that she had, as far as her family was concerned, kind of a rough beginning. Certainly financially, it was never a rough life for her, but personally, I think that is a bit of a rough way to come into the world.
A question from Gabby says, I know there's hope of doing a program this summer about women's fashion at Fort Niagara. As a little preview, could you tell us a bit about her wardrobe? Is there anything we might be a little surprised by?
Her wardrobe. Well, so Elizabeth, we know that when she's packing to come to Canada, which again, for thinking, you know, about what actually ends up happening for her, where she's living in tents at Naval Hall, then she's living in tents on the escarpment, and you know, she's living in these very roughshod houses through most of her time. She packs a lot of silk to bring with her, and that is not uncommon for wealthy women in the 18th century. Again, Elizabeth would not have been doing her own cooking, cleaning, you know, any of that kind of work where you could get dirty. She's got hired help, some of whom she brings over from England, some of whom she hires after she's arrived here. We know she writes when she gets to the Niagara region that she's hired a sergeant's wife, she doesn't specify which sergeant, to work in her household and help her with her kids. So she's wearing definitely, I would assume, you know, probably very fashionable clothing for the 1790s. And we know for a fact a lot of it was silk as well.
Can you elaborate on Elizabeth's educational background?
Unfortunately, there's not a lot known about what specific education she was given. But based on her social class and what I know of other wealthy women in Britain in this time period, she was probably privately tutored. Again, she's got this immense fortune that is paying for her. She's also, you know, got an aunt and uncle who are very, very wealthy who are taking care of her. So she's got private tutelage probably throughout her lifetime. Or at least throughout her adolescence. And we know that she is very focused on art and art education specifically. One thing that she writes home a lot about, so when she's in Canada and she's writing back to Mrs. Hunt, who is taking care of her daughters who are still in England, that she stresses very, very much is that she really wants to make sure that her girls keep up with their painting and their sketching. She really feels like that's an important thing for her children to spend time in and to invest in their education.
Catherine Wood, you have your hand up. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. Hi, Betty. Betty Levin. We know one another from our book club. I just wanted to say hello. But I'm curious to know about the pigments that were used in her watercolors. They're notoriously known for being very impermanent, and yet they seem very, very you know, very brilliant considering the time. Is there information about the types of watercolor pigments that you use?
That is a fabulous question. I am not an art historian, so I unfortunately don't have a very detailed answer for you. But it may seem like the 18th century was a million years ago, but as far as like the grand scheme of human history is concerned, the 1790s are not that far away. And so because of this, definitely there are resources out there about what kinds of pigments you know, people are using, and so that I would recommend, you know, if you can give it a Google, you can maybe look into contacting some art museums, especially those that have a large 18th century collection. They might have more information for you regarding the specific pigmentations. As far as how long Elizabeth's paintings have lasted, we do know that she took particular care to make sure that the drawings that she did stay very well preserved, and that she kept them, you know, very carefully while she was traveling, because she wanted to keep these were essentially memories that she's putting down. One anecdote that unfortunately couldn't fit into the presentation is there is a point in time when Simcoes are living at Navy Hall when Elizabeth writes that she left the dog in the room where she kept her best map of Canada and the United States, which she had drawn herself, and the dog ripped it to pieces, and she was super mad because she had to paste it all back together later that night, which I feel like is one of those timeless things that any pet owner can relate to in any time period. But yeah, as far as her paintings go, she really does as much as she can try to keep them safe and away from the dog and out of harm's way as much as she can.
I would like to say that the Archives of Ontario has an art curator and who may know and be able to provide some information on the pigments used at the time. Is Navy Hall still located at Niagara-on-the-Lake or any of their remains?
That is a great question. So unfortunately, I moved to this area right before COVID hit. The border has been closed for most of the time that I've lived in the Niagara region. So I do not actually know. I've never had a chance to go over and see, but I see Toby is here. Toby, do you know the answer to it?
Yes, it's still there. Am I muted?
Nope, you're unmuted now. You muted yourself now, but you answered it. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm scrolling. Was her collection private, or did she sell any of her works at the time?
Her collection was mostly just for herself. I know that she did, and she writes about that she does, you know, sketches and portraits of other people and then like gifts them to them as her friends. But her collection was mostly, you know, just for herself, for her own pleasure.
Which of Elizabeth's paintings or sketches did you spend the most time with your research? Is there one you would like to spend more time with?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I had a really good time looking at all of her paintings, but I especially enjoyed any of the ones that she painted while she was in the Niagara region. And there were so many, you know, that she did that I just, you know, I couldn't fit into this presentation. But like I was saying, you know, I moved to this area right before COVID broke out. So I've only been here, you know, a little over a year now. But it's been interesting to see, you know, my home, this place, my new home, through the eyes of someone who also had just moved to this area, and to see the things that she and I both kind of focused on and both kind of looked at and thought about. When I first moved here, I went to Niagara Falls about once a month just to kind of see how the falls change throughout the year. And so it was neat to kind of go through some of Elizabeth's pictures of the falls as well, where she also is going, you know, many times throughout the year, charting the changes that happen. And what an interesting and kind of special connection to have with someone who lived, you know, 200 odd years before me, but we share this thing of moving to this very special place and seeing great beauty around us.
Did she ever express any thoughts about the Americans across the river?
She does. So another interesting thing about Elizabeth is that she is very much a party girl. That is not surprising considering that she comes from great wealth. She is very used to being a hostess. So one thing that she does while she's here at Niagara a lot is she's hosting dances and card parties. And there are dances and card parties where Americans show up and join the crew. She has generally positive things to say about the Americans that she knows personally. She is very much afraid of a formal attack. And certainly there is a fair amount of tension between the United States and Britain in the 1790s. The American Revolution had wound down in the 1780s, but in the 1790s, there's still a little bit of negotiation of who technically is supposed to be where. And so that is where this tension is coming from, particularly in this area where the border is so close. But yeah, she generally has no problems with the Americans that she knows personally. She doesn't hold it against them, certainly.
Did she ever do any paintings or sketches of her children?
Not that I am aware of. One thing that I wish I could have done and definitely intend to do in the future is to go to the Archives of Ontario. They have several hundred sketches and paintings from Elizabeth. And I'd love to go and look at a lot of those and kind of piece through it. So as far as I'm aware, I have not seen any, but that doesn't mean that they do not exist.
Quoting our Facebook post today, our quote says, "It is important to remember that women in the 18th century were not bystanders in their own lives." That quote really struck the person, and it said, with that in mind, how does a historic site responsibly balance the reality of women's hardships with their incredible vitality and industry?
That's a great question. I think the important thing to remember when interpreting women's history, which is something that I've been doing for 7 years now, is to remember that women are people, and people, no matter where they find themselves in life, will always find a way to make choices for themselves. And so we can, of course, and we should, of course, talk about the fact that not everyone has the same rights or the same agency in the 18th century, but we don't have to paint those people as totally helpless, unable to do anything for themselves. We just have to kind of, I guess, like pump up the things that they were able to do for themselves, the choices they were able to make for themselves, and kind of make that an equal balance with things were very different and positions in society were very different and sometimes very difficult for certain groups of people, but that doesn't mean that they were, incapable of doing anything to help themselves.
Did Elizabeth do any oil paintings?
As far as I'm aware, no. A friend of mine who studies art history told me that one thing that was pretty common in the 18th century was that women were not oil painters generally. If they were doing art and painting specifically, a lot of times they were doing watercolors.
Catherine, do you have another question, or was that the hand icon from before? Okay, well, I just read all the questions through the chat. I mean, if there's any more questions, feel free to keep typing or unmute yourself and ask a question if you'd like.
Otherwise, thank you so much, everyone, for coming out tonight. It's really great to see all of your faces and to be able to share this really fun research that I got to do. Certainly, if you think of questions later on, I think it's safe to say you can email Erica them and she can forward them to me, and I can do my best to email you back and get you the information that you'd like. But thank you so much. I hope that you'll consider coming out and seeing me in person this summer while I'm on the field. But yeah, thank you very, very much. And keep your eyes out on our Facebook for other upcoming events that we are going to be having here at the fort.
Thank you.